so glad you're here. This is a wonderful opportunity to hear from Dean Orobator and Professor Raby. So what I'd like to do first, though, is start with a land acknowledgement as we're gathered here today. Let us pause to acknowledge that Santa Clara University sits on the land of the Ohlone and Muwekma Ohlone people who trace their ancestry through the Mission Dolores, Santa Clara, and San Jose. We remember their connection to this region and give thanks for the opportunity to live, work, learn, and pray on their traditional homeland. Let us take a moment of silence to pay respect to the elders and to all Ohlone people of the past and present. Thank you so much. My name is Allison Benders, and I serve as the Vice President for Mission and Ministry here at Santa Clara University. So I want to say welcome to everyone here. President Sullivan, welcome. Welcome to faculty, staff, students, and community members. We're really, really grateful that you're here for this conversation, and we hope that it will be enlightening for everyone. So the conversation is the future of a listening church, a conversation with Dean Orobator from JST, the Jesuit School of Theology. So I'm so pleased to introduce Dean Orobator to you, because some of you know him, of course. He's a Jesuit who hails from Nigeria, but he's a world traveler and, of course, welcomed wherever he goes. We welcomed him to Santa Clara as the dean up at the Jesuit School of Theology in August. And then, unfortunately, we didn't see him that much because he shortly headed off to Rome to participate in the Synod for Synodality. Some of you may know him as a scholar, a distinguished theologian and scholar, and he writes speaking about theological ethics, theology and ethics and feminist issues from the African context and expresses that voice. He's widely sought after on ecclesial issues and church matters, and he's been leading the initiative here at Santa Clara and from the Jesuit School of Theology outward on the Synod, trying to get the word out that ours is a listening church, and we have to participate in that listening and contributing to the future of the church. So Dean Orobator will be in conversation with Elyse Raby. Elyse is an assistant professor in the Department of Religious Studies here at Santa Clara, and her teaching and research focus on the study of the church, and especially how embodiment and gender and the church intersect in conversation. So what I'd like to do, though, is close with, close my introduction and then welcome Bator up. Pope Francis spoke at the end of the first session on synodality, and also depend on Dean Orobator to tell us a little more about synodality. So I'll trust you for that. So what Pope Francis said, and I think it helps us for our conversation today, this is the church that we are called to dream. A church that is the servant of all, the servant of the least of our brothers and sisters, a church that never demands an attestation of good behavior, but welcomes, serves, loves, forgives. A church with open doors that is a haven of mercy. So with that, let us welcome Bator, Dean Orobator, to speak with us.
Thank you very much, Alison, and thank you to all the members of your team for this opportunity to have this conversation on synodality. The invitation I received asked me to talk about my experiences and takeaways from the Synod. And I'm going to do that through three moments, but I want to open with a quiz. We're in a school. A quiz. Yes. So I'm going to read out some statements and ask who said this. The Synod is a hostile takeover of the Church of Jesus Christ. Oh, there is a prize, by the way. The Synod is a hostile takeover of the Church of Jesus Christ. Any guesses? He got it. He got it before you. That was Cardinal Mueller. Cardinal Mueller, there's your prize. Cardinal Mueller was the head of the dicastery for the faith. He's German, and he was one of the very first who spoke against the very idea of synodality. And guess what Pope Francis did? He invited him to the Synod. Next question. The Synod is a toxic nightmare.
Bishop Strickland?
He could have said that. He could have said that. The Synod is a toxic nightmare. He too could have said that. But this was said by George Pell, Cardinal Pell, of blessed memory, and Australia. And then the final one, the Synod is a Pandora's box.
Bishop Strickland?
Burke. You still get the prize. Please. Now, my point is to understand that the very notion of synodality is a contested notion. And the practice of synodality is contested. Pope Francis has said that this is the direction that God invites the church to take in the third millennium, but not everybody agrees with him. So my first takeaway from the Synod is this experience of resistance and opposition that not only preceded the Synod itself, but actually manifested in various ways during the Synod. I want to mention 3 lenses through which I will share my experiences. The first I call disruptive architecture. Disruptive architecture. The second, constructive configuration. And the third, transformative process. Disruptive architecture. I wrote a piece just after the Synod, and I titled it, A Synodal Architecture of Immense Theological Proportions. And a Jesuit in Australia wrote me and said, well, I actually Googled that expression, synodal architecture. It's not on Google, so it must be really original. As some of you know, the Synod was held in an unusual venue. It was held in what is called the Paul VI Hall, which is a cavernous, and I described it as an aircraft hangar. It could actually house 3 Dreamliners with space for some Cessnas. It's that big. But what happened was that hall was repurposed for the Synod. And the organizers created round tables. Now, anybody who is familiar with the Synod knows that's not the Synodal Hall. There is a purpose-built Synodal Hall at the Vatican where everything synodal takes place. Francis opted not to use that hall. And when you go to that hall, which sits above the Paul VI aula or hall, what you see is an amphitheater. And it slopes towards the front. And it matters where you sit. Because the closer to the front you are, the more important you are in the hierarchy. And you can tell also by the color of the skull caps. The ones for the cardinal are dominant towards the end, sloping towards the end, and the ones for the bishops sort of are up there in the back. And in front is Pope Francis and 2 cardinals assisting him. That's the Synodal Hall. And so you can see what it meant to move the Synod from this hall to Paul VI, where you had round tables with people actually having conversations. Now that was disruptive for many people because it signaled a new way of envisaging the church as the people of God in conversation, in dialogue, in discernment about matters of consequence. The people of God. And this choice of moving the Synod to this kind of space of small groups in conversation was described by one observer as an existential displacement. But what it really meant was it placed the people of God at the very heart, at the center of the community called church. Second point, constructive configuration. Who was at the Synod? Now, if you go back to the original Synodal Hall, that place is reserved for bishops. And when you look at images from previous synods, it's very clear that this is a synod of bishops. Now, what Francis did was to invite people from all across the globe. Where it was formerly the preserve of just bishops, it became an open space for a diversity and variety of people. It showed that the church was truly a global church. Not only just traditionally Western or European, but African, Asian, Latin American. All the components that make a global church. But also it gave visibility to specific demographics within this church. It was lay faithful. It was women. It was young people in that space. So we had 364 voting members in the Synod. About a quarter of these 364 were lay, religious men and women, and young people. You have to appreciate the fact that this is not your normal synodal configuration. And that was a problem for many. It meant that irrespective of your station, your status, or your situation, you had a place. You had a seat at the table. And again, that was not something that many people were comfortable with. There was a certain intimacy in that experience that was completely unsettling for some people. Each small group, there were 36 small groups of about 11 or 10, depending on the configuration, was led by a facilitator who was not a member of the synod. And the facilitator determined who spoke and for how long. It didn't matter whether you were a patriarch or somebody else. You had your 3 minutes. Now, for someone who might be used to giving instructions, it would be difficult now to receive instructions. And I saw that happen. I saw people struggle to listen to others. I heard people trying to impose their opinions on others. And that was a struggle. But that was not the biggest challenge in terms of the configuration. When you think of it, this was a synod of bishops. It was a synod, that's the official title. It's a synod of bishops. And so one of the difficult tension that arose during the synod was to determine the status, the legitimacy of a synod of bishops that includes people who are not invested with episcopal authority, as some of us were described. So how do you have a synod of bishops that includes non-bishops? And in fact, during the synod, it became very apparent that for some people, the configuration undermined the legitimacy of this synod, to the extent that some would not even refer to it as synod, but will call it an assembly of the people of God, to make a distinction. And when you read the final report, you will see in the final report there was actually a proposal that we should have a bicameral system where you have an assembly of everybody comes, everybody, but then we have the synod of bishops that sits above this assembly of the people of God. This was the point where Pope Francis made his, I believe, third intervention, when he reminded the delegates that no matter your station or status or situation in the church, you come from and you belong to the people of God. That is the fundamental reality. We are all the people of God. But the takeaway from that is that the tension about power and privilege remains a contentious and a real issue for the church. To have a space where everybody has a voice, where everybody belongs, it's not a given. For some, that challenges the very essence of a church that is conceived of as hierarchical, and I would add, patriarchal. I remember a situation where in my group, we had a very senior church personality, shall we say, and which was demonstrated not only in his poise and gait, but also in his sartorial, shall we say, embellishment. And he always insisted on what was the right teaching always reminded the group of what was the right teaching. He couldn't bear to listen to a different perspective. And it didn't surprise me that he couldn't stay the course. He left the synod before it ended. This was an unusual configuration. This was a different church from what he understood. And finally, a transformative process. Francis makes a distinction between creating processes and occupying space. The synod in Francis's vision was about creating a process. That is a process for addressing issues, even difficult issues. And this process entails listening, dialogue, discernment. And the methodology introduced into the synod of conversation in the spirit or spiritual conversation had never been trialed in any synod prior to this synod. And that's the methodology that defines this transformative process of dealing with contentious issues. Are we able to sit first to listen to the Spirit, to one another, and make room for opinions that we may not agree with or positions that we may oppose? That's the methodology. That's the process. I know there's been a lot said about the outcome of the synod, that, it did not address all the issues, that some of the issues were not addressed the way it was expected. But the synod was never about dealing with it was a synod on synodality. It was about creating a process that would allow us to address issues in a way that is, it's repetitious, synodal. That is, journeying together, walking together, listening to the Spirit and to one another. Some would associate synodality with Pope Francis, and that is true. But I don't think the Pope has monopoly over this idea of synodality. It's been present in the church. It's just that finally someone has the courage to call the church to actually begin to practice it. And so what happened in Rome in October was, I would say, first global manifestation of how we can actually be synodal. What happens after that is work for all of us to do. Thank you.
We've invited Elyse Raby, Professor Raby here, to first offer a few reflections, and then to have a conversation with Dean Orobator, and then an opportunity for the rest of us here to ask questions. So, Elyse, please.
Great. Thank you. Is this on? Am I working? Great. Thank you so much to Dean Orobator for some insight into both the resistance that you felt at the Synod, but also the way that process unfolded, and perhaps the hope that it offers. Hope, maybe some despair, but hopefully hope for the future of the church. I was struck at the outset by your use of architectural metaphors and the move from a hall to round tables, and the way that the round tables facilitated a different kind of encounter. And it reminded me of the metaphor of St. Peter's Basilica being built on top of Old St. Peter's in Rome, and the way that these different moments in church architecture in Rome have kind of signified different moments in the way that the church is structuring itself, kind of building on top of something old, which involves a kind of tearing down, not simply a refurbishing, bringing in new furniture to an old building, but to tearing something down and rebuilding something new. So the resistance, I think, makes sense if you're watching your house be potentially torn down. That sense of fear, resistance certainly makes sense. I want to begin just with a few very short remarks with where you left off about process. Because when I was following some of the Synod news in October, of course, given my field of work, I had friends texting me saying, what's going on? What's your hot take? And I heard a lot of expressions kind of by the end when the synthesis document came out and the media covered it, people expressing frustration that nothing happened. They were expecting kind of maybe new policies on same-sex marriage or women's ordination or the diaconate. And there was this kind of frustration that none of these issues, policy reforms that they were hoping for had come to be. And my response was always like, it is the process. We're playing the long game here when we do Catholic theology and ecclesiology. And I think it's that emphasis on process rather than outcome that is so difficult for the church in the United States to understand, given our own cultural context where we usually try to institute cultural reforms by instituting legal reforms. And so we pursue changes in law and policy in order to institutionalize a different kind of culture that we would like to see. And it seems that what Pope Francis and the synodal process is doing is trying to turn that around, in some ways doing both at the same time, kind of creating new infrastructure, round tables, in order to then create a cultural change, but in order to then find ways for that cultural shift to be institutionalized and made structural at all levels of the church. And I think it's that emphasis on process that can be hardest to swallow in the United States, because we just want to see results, and we want to be able to vote our way into those results. It's kind of an interesting, I know the term decolonizing is important these days, and when I was reading the synodal documents, I thought this is kind of a decorporatizing of our ecclesial imagination. But of course, I wasn't at the Synod, but I did read the Synod final document, and just to offer, I think, just 2 or 3 remarks on that, I found it to be astounding in the openness of the document, not as a document that is aiming to solve issues or answer questions or institute new policy, but to really raise up questions, points of disagreement. And there are points where you see many different voices reflected on women in the diaconate, on LGBTQ issues in the church. So I was struck by the kind of radicalness of the openness, especially also the openness to transparency and accountability within the hierarchy. There are specific proposals for performance reviews of bishops, for identifying processes and structures that allow for a regular audit of how priests and deacons are carrying out their ministries. There are calls for reform of seminary formation, having seminarians be taught alongside the people of God by lay ministers, including women, having seminary formation involve actual service learning opportunities. As a theologian, I read this and thought, no kidding, we've been saying this for a long time. But it's amazing to see those come forth in this kind of document and to see that they're really finally getting a hearing. And it's those kinds of processes and structures that a generation or 2 from now, I think, will really have an impact. I'm sure the question of women at the Synod and the future of women in the church will come up, so I'm going to leave that for now. But because this question of women and ordination and the diaconate often goes together, I was also struck just by the reimagining of what the diaconate is in the document, a kind of reassessing of the diaconate not as just making up for the shortage of priests or assistants kind of in liturgical settings, but really trying to reimagine the diaconate as a ministry of service to the poor, the marginalized, the people of God, which is already in so many ways happening by those who are not ordained to the diaconate. So my questions for you then, I think, are threefold. Which one do I want to pose first? I'll leave the hardest one for last. The first one, I think, is given your involvement in the synodal processes in the African church, Did you find that the concerns, the contributions of the African church were adequately represented? I know you spoke earlier about how it was a truly global church at the Synod. Did that experience ring true for you, that the concerns of and gifts of your people were present in the Synod? That's my first question. My second question is kind of how you felt as a clergy member who has a particular position of authority in the church, but who is not a bishop, vis-a-vis the lay contributors and lay voting members. You mentioned a bit of the resistance from some bishops to listening to others, but you hold kind of an interesting third space between bishop and laity. I'm just curious to your reflections on the dynamic of that process. And I was again reminded of the kind of process of Vatican II, where so much of the learning at the Second Vatican Council was happening not on the council floor, but in the coffee bars in St. Peter's Square, which I love, were called Bar Jonas, Bar Abbas. And then when women were finally brought to Vatican II, they made a third bar because women couldn't drink coffee with the bishops, and they called that one Bar None. And I love that joke that they came up with. So was there a similar kind of like synod outside the synod? Was there a place outside the hall where richness was happening too? And then perhaps my most challenging question, given your role as dean at Santa Clara University, given that the synod is aiming at transforming not just the inner workings of the church, but the church at every level, and especially the working document of the synod talks about transforming the way that Catholic institutions, including schools, function. Is there a way that Santa Clara University can or needs to create some more of those round tables itself in its own kind of procedures of functioning synodally as a Catholic institution?
Thank you. Thank you. I'll try to speak to the three questions. Just for context, since 2021, I've been involved with the African bishops through what we call the African Synodality Initiative, which the Jesuits created and led to help the bishop prepare for and participate in the synod. One of the interesting dynamics of that was the tension between engaging in the synodal process and defining an African position. It was a constant tension during the preparatory period amongst the bishops. Eventually, the position was to participate and to engage openly rather than come with an African position. So in that sense, the synod was not about responding to a particular position, but rather inviting input, contribution from the various parts of the church. Were there inputs and contributions? Yes. There was a particular emphasis, for example, on family, as understood within the African context. There's a particular emphasis on young people and the challenges they face within the African context. And during the synod itself, even though this was not a discerned position, it became very clear that several of the African bishops stood resolutely against even the mention of the term LGBTQ. And that, in a sense, became the lens through which the African presence and participation was actually defined, which I thought was rather unfortunate in many ways. So in that sense, I would say the synod that created space for people from Africa to make their contribution and identify particular issues of concern, but not in a way that I would say is a unified position. In terms of the interactions, I don't think there was anything close to what happened at Vatican II, so we didn't have the 3 bars. Okay, but there were many opportunities for interaction, informally. And rather than dwell on that, I want to say that the key thing for me was the opportunity for people to speak for themselves, to speak their own truth. And I want to mention 2 particular instances of this. Young people. I think one of the outcomes of the Synod for me was the opportunity finally for the church to recognize that young people can bring the church into a space where it needs to be in a way in which the church doesn't need to be frightened. And that is the digital space. As you saw in the final document, there was a lot said about digital missionaries, young people bringing the church to a space where other young people are willing and eager to engage. And that was very important. The second thing I would say is about, you mentioned the issue, the question of women. I think this was the first synod that I know about where women were not talked about as a question or a problem, but where women actually stated and articulated in their own voice what they were concerned about in the church. And I think this was intimidating for some people, because by my reckoning, the women who were present at the synod were competent in their own right. Nobody was doing them a favor. They were there because they were competent, committed, and faithful members who cared about their church and who were there to speak their truth. And that came out very strongly on issues of diaconate, the female diaconate, ordination of women, ministry and co-responsibility in the church. I heard very strong voices of women articulating perspectives founded in their experience as what the document calls teachers of synodality in the church. And that was very important. So that kind of interaction took place within the synod. And I would say it, again, created tension, because you have to understand that for many people who were in that space, they were not used to this kind of arrangement where people, as we're called, who are not vested with episcopal authority, actually have competence and articulate their position with conviction. So that really was an interesting dynamic in the synod. Now I forget the third one.
Can we have more round tables?
Yes.
Synodal halls at Santa Clara University.
I mentioned the fact that the synod is about creating processes. And I still believe that that's a key, fundamental constitutive element of synodality, creating processes. And this means trying to identify ways and means through which we are able to function at whatever level, family, institution, schools, that entails elements of listening, dialogue, and discernment as a community. We just had our board meeting at the Jesuit School of Theology, and those who were there, we had round tables for our board meeting. That's how we conducted our meetings, where we had small groups of people listening to, exchanging, and feeding that into a more a plenary process for the group as a whole. So there are ways of engaging synodally, not only in terms of just the configuration, because that's the easy part. The more challenging part for me is, are we able to make room for the other? In other words, are we able to shift our position because we have heard God's Spirit speaking to us through the other? That's the challenge. Am I able to let go of my own leanings and ideological positions to allow room for the other? And talking about process, when people complain that, this really didn't yield anything, I think it's probably part of a mindset that wants to see tension between. One of the things I've learned to appreciate in this particular context of my present mission is the very strong polarization in the church between what's called right, left, conservative, what's the other one? Liberal, traditional, progressive. There was a bit of that within the synodal process itself. But in fact, there was no space for that fight to take place. There was no space for that fight to take place. And I'll give you one example. During the synod, when a particular topic is introduced, everybody is invited to engage in conversation in the plenary session with that particular issue. So what's your take on it? What's your position? What's your opinion? And that happened for the most part. But for a few, they had prepared statements. It didn't matter what the topic was. As soon as it was time to make contributions, you hit the button and you read your statement. It didn't matter whether it related to the subject of conversation. I want to make my stand. And this is born of that tension between, right, left, etc. Just to make sure that I am able to, this is an opportunity for me to make my stand. But functioning synodally calls us to a conversion. That is, to break down those barriers and begin to see how we make common ground, how we create common space for dialogue, for listening, and for discernment. And that's possible. For institutions, it's possible within families, organizations, and definitely here as well.
And it strikes me that might be one of the greatest ways in which the church can function as a beacon, as a sacrament, as light and hope in the U.S. these days, is if the synodal process can find ways, create ways to break through some of that polarization and bring different people around the same table. I think that might be one of the greatest contributions of the church's mission to this moment in the United States, regardless of how any particular issue gets resolved. But if there can be a kind of speaking to one another, hearing one another across differences again, then I think that in itself is an enormous contribution.
I agree.
We invite questions now from the rest of you. There's a mic going around. Okay.
That's okay.
I just wanted to ask, you say 13 people or 12 people around the table. Did you switch tables, or were you with the 13 people the whole entire time?
Oh, great. Thank you so much for that question. Yes, we switched table 5 times. Depending on the topic, there were 4 modules. So you have 4 different tables. And then for the 5th module, you return to your original table. And the tables were also assigned according to language preferences. So we had 5 languages. And then they were mixed groups. I was in one group where of the 11 people who were there, each one was from a different country. They were very well, designed to create that diversity. And also in terms of who's present, women, men, young people, bishops, cardinals. It was a very well-designed group.
What language? Did that group use what language?
You mean my group?
The one you were talking about, where they were from 5 different countries?
Oh, for me, that was my French group.
Oh.
It was a French group. Yeah.
Father, a great deal of your presentation was focused on the resistance of perhaps hierarchy, who was rather talk than listen, and had their own prepared statements when issues came up. Taking those hierarchy individuals back to their respective dioceses and them confronting the scandals that arose in the church. It seems to me that resistance to deal with the issues might be fundamental to the problems in the church worldwide. In other words, not listening to victims, but resisting.
Thank you very much. I think you raise a very important question regarding or relating to the many failings of the community called church and the devastating consequences that had on lives of people. And what's been demonstrated over the years is that at the root of that crisis which you reference is failure of leadership, failure of accountability, failure of transparency, and as you put it, a resistance that refuses to listen. I think this is part of what synodality calls us to begin to, in a way, break down or dismantle this resistance that first prefers to protect the institution or claims to have the answer to every challenge, crisis situation, or takes refuge in privileges conferred by clerical status. I think these are some of the challenges. And that's why I wrote a piece once for the tablet, and I said, well, time will tell. As I ended the piece, time will tell. Will there be a change? Will there be a transformation? Something has started. Whether that becomes institutionalized, as Elyse said, in a way not to harden it into an inflexible structure, but rather becomes a way of proceeding. That's yet to be seen. I was having a conversation with someone yesterday who told me that he was told, look, next year the Synod is over and Pope Francis will die. Think of it. Next year the Synod is over and Pope Francis will die. That's how someone sees this moment in the church. In other words, it's just a passing phase. Just let's wait him out. It'll be over. And that's scary. That's really scary.
So you give me hope, thanks to both of you. I did want to just point out, at least we do a lot, too much with law and politics in this country. However, there's a whole cultural capacity for mediation and restorative justice and things like that. And we do that in the church. I've worked with Lynn on that. There's peer mediation in the schools. So Judge Terry knows all about this. So not just the hard settling of an issue, a case, but really an open, facilitative talking. So maybe we can draw on some of those skills as we move forward.
Thank you very much. Thank you. And I think that's very important to keep in mind. That it's a whole environment. It's an ecosystem, where a lot can happen, and, it's work for everybody. Yeah, thank you.
And if I could just add a word to that too, what I was, some of the other places where I was most impressed by the final synthesis of the document was its openness to learning from other human and social sciences on issues of sexuality, marriage, etc., but on issues of transparency, accountability, organizational management, actually building structures to help synodality endure. So I think that's exactly another area where the Synod seems to be opening up those conversations, inviting and encouraging theologians, bishops, pastors to engage with other areas of expertise.
Hi, wonderful, wonderful. Oh, I don't feel like I need a mic, but just amazing. The third church is what I learned with the expansion into Africa and Asia and the freedom and spirituality that comes from it. So I have one quick comment. Did you sense with that uncomfortableness that your synodality for synodality, I'm hopeful that some of that they were just so calcified in their behavior versus those that were calcified in their opinion. Do you understand what I'm saying? Could have just been an internal struggle just because of the format versus someone who's dead set against it. Did you?
I think the answer is yes, in the sense that it's both. That I had a sense that for some, and that's why I read out, the characterization of the Synod by some very high-ranking church officials, that it's very hardened in terms of their own beliefs, that resistance against. But for some, it was trying to adjust to something new. And I have to say this to be fair, that on several occasions, it was very important, I heard people say, I have understood this differently. I have a different position on this matter now. And without breaking any confidentiality, we had a when we dealt with a very sensitive issue on my table, there were 5 bishops at that table, and 3 of them were dead set against this issue moving forward. And 2 of them said, it can be different. It doesn't have to be this way. And you could see that tension between bishops. The 3 more or less expected that there would be a rallying of the group, that is, of bishops. And they were sort of surprised by that.
I have to tell you quite honestly, cradle Catholic, left the church, Pentecostal route for a while, life changed, went down the diaconate path, was dismissed. Hindsight, it would have constrained me. And now I find myself here getting a master's. And to be honest with you, sir, the more I learn about where we came from to where we are, my heart breaks. My heart breaks. What after Francis? That's my question, because unfortunately he's not going to live forever. And you know what I'm saying. I mean, is there enough momentum that this, I don't want to be morbid, but it's a practical question.
Well, thank you very much. Again, I want to also honor your history and your path, as you just laid it out. But I am hopeful. And I know the business people will say hope is not a strategy. It is. And I think it works. But it takes hard work. I believe that there is momentum building. And I believe that momentum is sustainable. but only if we do the hard work. We, the church. Yes, we, the church. Only if we do the hard work. And not simply leave it to anybody who claims to have more right to this process on account of certain privileges, perks, and positions.
It would seem like any movement, any shift like that would have to involve some sort of by the people education. Here's what we need, here's what we need.
And there are vital people involved in this. You know, the fact that we're having this conversation, I know the work that, Professor Raby does, and there are many. One of the things I've noticed now is that there's just been a kind of an explosion of activities around synodality across institutions. If you just look at, the Catholic media space, the amount of activities, synodality-related activities, it's very comforting. And it's a mix of people involved in it. It's the hierarchy, it's the academy, it's parishes, it's all kinds of, and that's very comforting. We have to sustain that so it doesn't become just a passing phase. We have to sustain that to keep that momentum going.
And speaking as a theologian on that too, the structure of the final synthesis document gives kind of on every, not topic question, but every point that was discussed, points of convergence, matters of consideration, and then proposals. And honestly, every one of the proposals could be a research agenda in its own right. I mean, there are calls for revisions of canon law, for further theological study on topic XYZ, for greater historical understanding of the various forms of the diaconate. I mean, the invitation to theologians and academics within the document is really extraordinary. It's a small world of theologians and academics out there for sure, but there's, so much fodder in this. And just to reiterate what Dean Orobator said, this is alive and well, I think, in the majority of at least the U.S. Theological Academy.
So reform of catechesis.
Great. We actually have only a few more minutes left. So, Tom, one more question, and then we'll close it up. Thank you.
Well, first of all, can I just say thank you so much for doing this. I'm so grateful that for what you've put together here. It sounds, as I'm listening to you as a psychologist, that the Synod could use some group therapy and a lot of volunteers.
Thank you.
My question is, as this filters down, my concern is that the people sort of in the choir are paying attention. Those of us who are very invested and engaged in academic life or whatever. And my question to you is, do you think the Synod has a prayer at kind of filtering down through its processes to the average person in the pew, the average, maybe more casual Catholic? Will they feel this at all over time, or will this only stay kind of in the preview of the choir?
Thank you very much. I think it depends on how the process is facilitated. I got a note from from a pastor in my home parish way back in Nigeria who said, "I'm still waiting for someone to mention synodality in the diocese." So that's why I said it depends. If it's a situation in which perhaps those who have responsibility for facilitating this actually default on their responsibility, then it's hard to see how that's going to percolate and filter through. But again, secondly, that's why I think it's important that we all take responsibility for it. We all take responsibility for making sure that the spirit, that the flame is kept alive and continues to animate all the various levels of the configuration of the church. I know Paul really had his hand up.
Yes, one more. All right. Thank you.
I don't need the mic, I'm sure, but
Maybe so others can hear
I'll
you.
use
Thank
it.
you.
You mentioned a lot of good stuff, Father. Thank you very much. The normal Catholic, and I'm a cradle Catholic as well, wants to know what now? You know, what's going to happen? Cardinal McIntyre, as you know, came up with a summary that we used in our group. And the number one out of 80 items that were discussed, the number one item, the only item that was tabbed urgent, was the place of women in the church, right? So I'd like to hear your comment on that. And secondly, what do we do now? It's tough to keep the ball rolling, you know, in the church. The church doesn't want to change. There hasn't been a lot said about clericalism, although I would like to hear you comment on that as well.
Thank you. I think there's a lot that is going to happen. There's still a second session of the Synod,
Yes.
which will happen in October, following which there will be a final publication from the Pope of the key issues that we will need to look at. But in terms of what we do, it's related to the conversation we had earlier on. We have to remain engaged in all the processes. I'm glad to hear that you're having conversations around key issues. We have to remain engaged. And on the particular question that you raised, it's interesting when you read the document for the post-synodal document, the synthesis document, it's an open question. It's an open question.
No answers, a lot of questions.
There are no answers yet. But again, the process should allow us as a community to arrive at some common ground. And that's what I'm hoping for, you know, going forward. But thank you, Paul.
What do you think about the number one issue being that of women?
Can you break that down a bit?
Well, what McElroy said, there were 80 items to be discussed, but only one of them was marked urgent, or to be voted on, to be talked about later, and so on.
Okay, well, I can give you what my contribution was on that question.
All right.
Okay, I came to the conclusion that where I stand as a Catholic is a position that would like the church to grant full access to ministry to its full congregation without discrimination. That's my position.
Hallelujah, brother.
As it would seem rather ironic to end a conversation about women's roles in the Synod in the future of the church without the women at the front speaking on the issue of women in the church. So just to steal one more minute, I mean, I hear the concerns that maybe nothing will actually happen with this. Reading that section of the document, there were pros and cons. I think the pro, first of all, is that this is an open question. It's astonishing that this is in a document coming from a synod of bishops, an open question about women's possibly ordained ministry in the church. It's the first time I've also seen that women are speaking and they are not being spoken about as a special topic, but are kind of woven throughout the conversation in many areas of the synod's document. There's affirmation over and over that the church is hearing the call for women's ordained, recognized participation in the church, also recognizing that that is an issue that is dividing the church. The concern that I see is that a lot of it is still tied up in the language of complementarity, which goes back to the papacy of John Paul II. So I think the risk is that when we do move into recognizing women's ministry and participation in the church, it may just end up as another kind of recognizing women as they're here doing great work. We wish we had ordained men in these positions. But I still retain hope as well.
Thank you, Professor Raby. Dean Orobator, would you like a closing remark or a word of hope for all of us, and then we'll thank you and.
No, but thanks for coming out, and for me, just having this moment demonstrates that, you know, this is a moment where we all feel we can be part of. It matters to us. we care about this community and we care about our belonging to this community. I would hope that we will continue to engage the other events that are planned for the future to carry on this kind of conversation as a community here at Santa Clara University. So thank you so much for coming out.
Thank you, Dean Orobator. And thank you, Professor Raby.
Thank you.
And thank you all for coming. Keep up the conversation. Take care.